They were considered a mad venture from the Pentagon, 1,000 artists, actors, and sound engineers sent to the front lines. But the German command wasn't fighting a bunch of amateurs. They were fighting a ghost with a weapon designed not to kill soldiers, but to kill their confidence in reality. In this film, we will show how, step by step, using inflatable tanks and fake radio transmissions, this theater of the absurd forced the Wehrmacht to attack nothingness and fall into complete strategic paralysis. This is the story of how the most cunning ruse in military history saved the lives of more than 15,000 people, winning key battles with the power of imagination. This was supposed to be their masterpiece, their magnum opus, the greatest performance ever staged on the theater of war. Operation Wehrmacht. The goal: to convince the entire German command that the U.S. Ninth Army was preparing to cross the Rhine 10 miles south of the actual crossing point. Everything they had learned over long months of fighting was thrown into creating this grand illusion. 600 inflatable objects, tanks, artillery, trucks, were secretly deployed under the cover of night. Gilbert Seltzer's sonic teams prepared their most complex score, the sounds of 2 full divisions, the 30th and the 79th. That's 30,000 men. The airwaves crackled like never before. Bob Tompkins's radio operators simulated the traffic of dozens of headquarters, from the company to the divisional level. Acting troops in the uniforms of these divisions' officers patrolled the roads, creating an atmosphere of preparation for a massive strike. They worked with the obsession of geniuses preparing for an opening night. Everything was on the line. Now, it all depended on one thing. Would they believe it? The German headquarters was buzzing with excitement. The scattered puzzle pieces that had tormented them for months were finally starting to form a clear picture. The intelligence officer reported to his general, his voice filled with unshakable confidence. A concentration of large U.S. armored and infantry forces has been detected in the Wehrmacht sector. According to sonic data, active preparations for a crossing are underway at night. Aerial reconnaissance confirms the presence of hundreds of vehicles. Our radio intercepts are picking up traffic from the headquarters of the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions. Intelligence sources report massive troop movements in the area. For the German command, this was the moment of truth. Finally, they had uncovered the Americans' main plan. All the chaotic, illogical activity of the past few weeks had been just a diversion. This was it, the main thrust. Here, in the Wehrmacht sector, they would commit their main forces. The general slammed his fist on the map. Finally, we know where they'll strike. We've got them. Orders flew out immediately. Move all reserves. The 116th Panzer Division, move south now. Concentrate all available artillery in this sector. They wouldn't just repel the attack. They would give the Americans a bloodbath at the crossing. They would annihilate 2 of their best divisions. Confidence returned. The strategic paralysis, brought on by months of doubt and inexplicable events, was gone. The enemy was understood. His intentions were clear, and the trap was set. The German war machine, deceived by the greatest performance in history, moved with a clatter and a roar toward its own defeat. It was rushing to the theater, not knowing that the real war was about to begin on a completely different stage. On the Ghost Army's positions in the Wehrmacht sector, there was silence. Not the tense silence before a battle, but a strange, deafening emptiness. At night, they had played their concert, the rumble of engineering work, the roar of engines. But with the dawn, everything fell still. The performance was over. Now, all that was left was to wait for the audience's reaction. At that very moment, 10 miles to the north, the real U.S. Ninth Army began its crossing of the Rhine. Soldiers launched assault boats, engineers laid pontoon bridges, and they all braced for hell, for a storm of fire from the German bank. They expected hundreds of guns. They expected a counterattack from the elite 116th Panzer Division. But they were met with only weak, disorganized resistance. The defenses were empty. The main German forces, their best reserves, had been sent south, to where 600 inflatable tanks and powerful loudspeakers awaited them. The Ninth Army crossed the Rhine, meeting almost no resistance. Thousands of American boys who should have died at that crossing remained alive. And it was all thanks to the silence, that deafening silence, which was the sound of the Ghost Army's success. For the German command, the realization came too late. The first reports of a crossing to the north seemed impossible. It couldn't be. The main attack had to be here, in the south. They were expecting it any minute. But the hours passed, and the attack never began. Meanwhile, panicked reports kept coming from the north. The front is broken. The Americans are on our side of the river. They are advancing inland. And then the general looked at the map, at the southern sector, where all his reserves were concentrated, and at the northern sector, where a gaping hole now existed, and he understood everything. It hit him with a cold, paralyzing clarity. We've been deceived. We've been led by the nose like children. All our intelligence, all our calculations, our entire strategy. It was all built on a lie, on a giant, monstrous performance. All the reserves were on the wrong side of the river. The front was broken, and the battle they were so confident of winning was lost before it had even begun. This wasn't just a tactical failure. It was a complete strategic paralysis, the shock of realizing the enemy had been fighting not with steel, but with imagination. And in that battle, they had suffered a crushing defeat. The deafening silence in the south turned out to be more terrifying than any artillery barrage. It was the sound of their own collapse. The war was not over yet, but for the German officer captured after the Rhine crossing, it was. He sat in interrogation, exhausted, defeated, trying to comprehend the catastrophe. An American officer was asking him questions, but he kept returning to the same thing, to the one thing that made no sense. "We were sure," he said with bitterness. "We were sure the main attack would be further south. All our artillery was aimed there. We heard their tanks. We heard their combat engineers. Our observers saw their camps. Intelligence confirmed it every day. How?" He trailed off, and his eyes held not so much hatred for the enemy as a deep, existential bewilderment. How can you fight a war when you can't believe your own eyes and ears? This question became the leitmotif of their defeat. Decades later, in memoirs and post-war analyses, German generals would describe the events of the war's final year as a series of inexplicable phenomena. They would write about phantom American divisions that appeared out of nowhere, about the enemy's incredible mobility, which allowed him to move vast forces overnight. They would never understand how their intelligence service, one of the best in the world, had been completely paralyzed. They would attribute it to the superiority of American logistics, never guessing that they had been fighting a theater of the absurd. And at that very same time, at Allied headquarters, Colonel Reeder was writing his final report. His band of mad artists had accomplished its mission. The experiment, which few had believed in, had surpassed all expectations. By the most conservative estimates, their actions had saved the lives of 15,000 to 30,000 soldiers. They had won key battles without firing almost a single shot. The order that came down from high command was short and categorical. Classify all data immediately. their achievement was too valuable a weapon to have its secrets revealed. The Ghost Army had to become a ghost once more, to vanish from the pages of history. Thus, two armies acknowledged the outcome of this invisible battle. One, in despair and bewilderment, unable to comprehend how one could lose a war to an illusion. The other, in secret, under the top secret classification, realizing that the most effective weapon is one the enemy doesn't even know exists. For the Germans, it was a defeat by an unknown force. For the Allies, a triumph of deception that the world would not learn about for another 50 years. The war was drawing to a close. The air smelled of spring and imminent victory. But for Private John Canepa and his comrades in the Ghost Army, the relief was mixed with a cold, clammy fear. A fear that had accompanied them throughout the entire campaign. But now, on the threshold of peace, it had become especially sharp. Their weapon was deception. Their uniform, a masquerade. Every time they went out for a performance, they tore the patches of their 23rd Headquarters Special Troops from their sleeves and sewed on others. The patches of the 6th Armored Division, the 30th Infantry, the 79th. They became other men, soldiers of other armies. Their jeeps bore foreign emblems. Their pockets held false documents. For German intelligence, this was a necessary part of the illusion. But according to the harsh laws of war, the Geneva Convention was crystal clear. A soldier wearing a uniform that did not correspond to his unit was not considered a combatant. He was a spy. And the punishment for espionage was singular: execution on the spot. No trial, no prisoner of war camp. John Canepa was certain. If they were captured, they wouldn't face interrogation, but a firing squad. How could you prove to a German officer that you weren't a saboteur, but just an actor in a grand military stage play? How could you explain that your rubber tank wasn't a weapon of murder, but a prop? These questions had no answers. This fear was their constant companion. It hid in the shadow of every patrol, in the sound of every approaching truck. It was especially hard during hold-the-line operations, when 1,100 men impersonated 15,000. They were alone on a huge section of the front, a thin, trembling thread of deception stretched to its limit. Any random breakthrough, any enemy reconnaissance group stumbling upon them, and it would all be over. They were heroes to their own side, but in the eyes of the enemy, they were spies. This paradox was the hidden psychological burden that each of them carried. They saved thousands of lives, but every day they risked their own, and not in honest combat, but because of a single patch on a sleeve. By the end of the war, the German army was in a state of collapse. Its ability to effectively analyze the enemy had been undermined, partly by the actions of the Ghost Army. The risk of being captured and exposed decreased with each passing day, but the fear, which had burrowed under their skin, did not go away. They were soldiers whose greatest secret was simultaneously their main weapon and their death sentence, and this secret was about to go with them into civilian life. May 1945. The war in Europe was over. Soldiers celebrated by firing into the air, hugging, crying with relief. But for the men of the Ghost Army, the end of the war was different. Quiet, almost secret. They were assembled one last time. Standing before them was not Colonel Reeder, but an officer from counterintelligence, and his order was absolute. Everything you did, everything you saw, all the operations you participated in, all of it is now a state secret of the highest level. You are forbidden to speak of this to anyone, not your relatives, not your friends, not other soldiers. You will go home, and when asked what you did in the war, you will answer, "I served in an engineering unit. Period. The curtain fell. Their great play was over, but there was no applause. Their feat, their cunning, the thousands of lives they saved, all of it was erased from history, buried under the classification top secret. Bill Blass, who had spent the war painting fake patches, returned home. Like everyone else, he tried to get used to peace, but a secret lived inside him. As he later recalled, it was unbearable. You couldn't even tell your wife that you fought the war with inflatable tanks. It would sound foolish, unbelievable. Men told stories of brutal battles, of storming cities, of true acts of heroism. And what could he tell? About how he deceived the enemy with giant speakers and rubber dolls? His war would forever remain his personal secret. They survived. They won. But they were deprived of a veteran's most fundamental right, the right to tell their story. The bitterness of this silence mixed with the relief of returning home. They were ghosts not only on the battlefield. They became ghosts in civilian life too, carriers of a story that no one was ever supposed to hear. And at that very same time, in Germany, captured generals and military historians were trying to analyze the reasons for their defeat. In their reports, strange phrases appeared again and again. One of the main reasons for the defeat on the Western Front, they wrote, was the incredible mobility and flexibility of the American forces, which we were never able to figure out. They never figured it out. They never learned that their adversary was 1,000 artists, and those artists, upon returning home, quietly put away their brushes and paints, forever burying the secret of their greatest masterpiece. Their triumph remained invisible, their war untold. Years passed, then decades. The veterans of the Ghost Army grew old. Bill Blass built a fashion empire. Ellsworth Kelly became an icon of painting. Arthur Singer became famous for his illustrations of birds. They lived vibrant, full lives, but a part of their souls remained forever there, on the fields of France, under the classification top secret. The secret they were ordered to keep became a part of them. They would meet, recall the past in whispers, afraid of breaking their oath. Their story lived only in their memories, slowly fading along with them. The world celebrated the heroes of the Normandy landings, the Battle of the Bulge, the assault on Berlin. But no one knew about the soldiers who won their battles with the power of imagination. Only in 1996, more than half a century after the war's end, was the secrecy classification lifted. The world finally learned about the Ghost Army, but it was too late. Most of the veterans did not live to see that day. For them, their feat remained an unsung secret. But the story was not completely forgotten. Historians, descendants, and enthusiasts began to piece together this incredible legacy, and their efforts bore fruit. The year is 2022. The capital, Washington. A few gray, stooped old men, nearly 100 years old, sat in the hall. They were the last surviving soldiers of the Ghost Army, fewer than 10 out of 1,100. Speeches were given in their honor. They spoke of cunning, of courage, of the lives saved, and finally, they were presented with the nation's highest civilian award, the Congressional Gold Medal. The forgotten triumph found its voice. It was the recognition they had waited for their entire lives. Recognition of the fact that in 1944 and 1945, the German High Command had been fighting not just an army, but a theater. And in that battle, it had suffered a crushing defeat. The story of the Ghost Army became more than just a tale of military deception. It became an anthem to creativity, proof that intelligence, art, and imagination can be as powerful a weapon as steel and gunpowder. Their weapon was illusion. But the lives they saved were real, and in that lies their immortal legacy. The curtain, lowered so long ago, finally rose, so the world could applaud its most unusual heroes. Early 1944, Colonel Harry Reeder, a career military man to his very bones, looked at the men who had been placed under his command and felt the ground slipping from under his feet. Before him stood 1,100 men, but they were not soldiers in the conventional sense of the word. They were artists from the best schools in New York, actors from Broadway theaters, advertising designers from Madison Avenue, sound engineers accustomed to working with microphones, not rifles. One veteran recalled, "Reeder didn't know what to do with us. We weren't like soldiers. We asked too many questions." The question that tormented the colonel himself was simple and frightening. How could he turn these creators into a combat unit? Could art deceive steel? The idea, born in the mind of journalist Ralph Ingersoll and inspired by British tricks in North Africa, looked like madness on paper. To create a mobile unit of tactical deception, a ghost army capable of simulating the presence of entire divisions where they did not actually exist. Deep skepticism reigned in the Pentagon, but the war demanded unconventional solutions, and the experiment was given the green light. The unit, given the dry name 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, was a chimera stitched together from 4 completely different parts. The 603rd Engineer Camouflage Battalion was responsible for visual deception, inflatable tanks, dummy artillery, fake airfields. A special signal company created the sonic illusion, broadcasting the roar of tank columns and the noise of bridge construction through giant speakers. The 3103rd Signal Service Company waged war on the airwaves, faking the radio traffic of entire headquarters. And the 4th part, Company C of the 406th Engineer Combat Battalion, provided their security. They were the only ones who really knew how to shoot. At that very same time, thousands of miles from America's training camps, a cold, calculated confidence prevailed in the headquarters of the German High Command. Wehrmacht analysts studied intelligence reports. They saw what they expected to see. The formation of new American units was following a standard pattern. Their doctrine was understood. It was predictable. A German general looked at a map dotted with the flags of Allied divisions. Each flag represented 15,000 soldiers, hundreds of tanks, thousands of tons of steel and gunpowder. Everything could be calculated: logistical chains, speed of movement, possible directions of attack. In this war of numbers and steel, there was no room for surrealism, for theater, for illusions. Intelligence reported a standard buildup of forces. Everything was under control. They believed in order, in logic, in steel. They did not yet know that they were about to fight not an army, but a theater. And the director of this theater of the absurd was a man who himself didn't fully believe his production would succeed. For Colonel Reeder and his bunch of crazy artists, the war was just beginning, and their first weapons would not be bullets, but canvas and camouflage netting. Ellsworth Kelly, the future genius of minimalism, looked at his hands. With these hands, he was used to mixing paints, finding the perfect line, creating harmony on canvas. Now, he was creating camouflage. He was learning not just to hide an object, but to break its form, to merge it with the background, to deceive the observer's eye. The war became his cruelest and most honest school of art. He watched as an illusion was born before his very eyes. How a tank, a 30-ton monster, took shape from air and rubber. Their new weapon was surreal. Over 1,200 inflatable decoys, manufactured at Goodyear and U.S. rubber plants. A Sherman tank weighing just 41 kilograms. It took 4 men to lift it, not because of its weight, but for the performance, so that an enemy observer, seeing it from afar, would believe in the weight of real steel. From a distance of 300 yards, as Kelly recalled, this rubber doll looked absolutely real. For the soldier artists, the war had turned into a gigantic, deadly art project. They were, as Corporal Bill Blass ironically put it, an advertising agency on the front lines. Their product was deception, and they produced it on an industrial scale. But the visual deception was only one act in this theater. The wizards at Bell Labs created the sonic palette of war for them. At the Fort Knox proving grounds, they recorded a symphony of destruction. The roar of tank engines, the clanking of treads, the shouts of officers, the rumble of engineering work. All of this was mixed onto magnetic tapes and steel wire. Powerful 500-watt speakers, mounted on half-tracks, could broadcast this hellish concert up to 24 kilometers away. At night, in complete darkness, they could make the Germans believe an entire armored division was moving right toward them. Radio operators created phantom conversations on the airwaves. Actors performed scenes in frontline towns. And over all of this hung a spirit of creative excitement. They were creating the largest and most dangerous production in history. Meanwhile, in the German headquarters, their own analytical work was underway. An intelligence officer, hunched over a table with impeccably clear aerial photographs, saw only what confirmed his calculations. A standard concentration of armored vehicles, a logical arrangement of artillery positions, a predictable buildup of forces. There was nothing in the photos to cause alarm, no anomalies. The Allies were acting by the book. Everything was clear. Everything was under control. He didn't know he was looking at a field filled with rubber dolls, that the tank tracks on the ground were left by a single tractor that had spent hours driving in circles to deceive his camera lens. He saw an army, but it was merely a canvas on which artists were painting a war, and soon this illusion would demand its first real blood. August 1944, the port of Brest. For Private John Jarvis and his comrades, this was their premiere, their first big show. At night, under the cover of a thick French fog, they set up their scenery, the hiss of compressors filling the rubber skins of the Sherman tanks with air, quiet commands, given in whispers. In a few hours, an entire armored battalion had sprouted up on an empty field. Then the airwaves came alive, filled with the fake chatter of staff officers. From powerful speakers hidden in the woods came the muffled clank of treads and the roar of engines, the sound of an approaching division. On the other side of the front line, a German intelligence officer couldn't believe his ears, and then his eyes. First, the radio operators reported in. A new call sign had appeared on the air, the headquarters of an American armored division. Then, observers from the forward posts confirmed. At dawn, they had seen the silhouettes of dozens of tanks. The data didn't add up. According to all calculations, all logistics, there couldn't be fresh American forces here. To move a division here would have taken them weeks, but it had appeared overnight. From where? How? The command demanded a double check, but the reports kept coming. They are here. They are real. And so, they believed. For John Jarvis, that moment came with a piercing whistle in the air. He instinctively hit the dirt a second before the first shell struck a few dozen meters away. And then, all hell broke loose. German artillery opened a hurricane of fire on their positions. Shells exploded everywhere, sending up geysers of earth and shrapnel. Jarvis lay in a ditch, pressing himself into the cold mud. The ground shook violently. In that moment, as he later recalled, came a chilling realization. Your deception has worked too well. They believe we are the real target, and they are trying to destroy us. In the German headquarters, there was a grim satisfaction. They had hit a concentration of enemy equipment. They had thwarted their plans. But the confusion remained. How had another division appeared so quickly? The question went unanswered. It hung in the air, becoming the first tiny seed of doubt sown in the flawless mechanism of the German war machine. And on the American side, when the shelling subsided, John Jarvis and the others rose from their cover, stunned, covered in mud, but alive. Around them stood their rubber tanks. Some had been pierced by shrapnel and were now slowly, with a pathetic hiss, deflating to the ground. This was the first blood of the illusion. They had proven they could make the enemy fight ghosts, and they had paid for it with real fear. Their theater had opened its first act, and the curtain rose to the roar of a real cannonade. France, the summer of 1944. 4 American soldiers stood in the middle of a field, looking at their Sherman tank. A bright, sunny day. The war, it seemed, had taken a short breather, and in that moment, they made a mistake. They needed to move the decoy. Forgetting caution, they walked up to the 40-kilogram rubber behemoth, easily lifted it onto their shoulders, and carried it across the field. It was at that exact moment that a local peasant woman saw them. She stopped dead in her tracks. Before her very eyes, 4 men were playfully carrying a 30-ton war machine. The soldiers froze. A single thought raced through their minds. If she's an informant, it's all over. The entire operation is a failure. Their whole carefully constructed illusion will collapse in an instant. But the woman didn't run to report to the Germans. She simply crossed herself and fled in terror. What could she have thought? Only one thing. The Americans possess inhuman strength. This incident, which became a legend within the unit, was a symbol of their work. They were walking on a knife's edge. Any slip-up, any accident could expose them. But sometimes, by an inexplicable irony of fate, their mistakes only strengthened the myth they were creating. For the German analytical department, what was happening increasingly resembled a bad dream. The data coming from the front contradicted all laws of physics and military science. An officer in headquarters looked at the 2 reports lying before him. Yesterday morning, an American division was recorded in Sector A, and this morning, it's already fighting in Sector B, 70 kilometers away. It was impossible. To move 15,000 men and hundreds of pieces of equipment that distance required weeks of preparation, thousands of trucks, and tons of fuel. It was a colossal logistical operation. The Americans, however, according to the reports, were doing it overnight. How? Theories were proposed, each one crazier than the last. Maybe they have some revolutionary supply system unknown to us? Maybe they're using some kind of super-fast transport. Or are our agents on the ground misinformed? Trust in their own intelligence, in the eyes and ears of the Third Reich, began to melt away. The Germans had encountered an enemy that moved with phantom speed, an army that broke all the rules. They tried to find a rational explanation, but there was none. They didn't yet understand that they were fighting not soldiers, but artists, and these artists, without even knowing it, were creating a legend of the American Army's inhuman strength, simply by carrying their rubber tanks from one field to another. September 1944. Luxembourg. The front line had stretched dangerously thin. A gap had formed, a 12-kilometer stretch with no one to defend it. This is where they sent in the Ghost Army. Their mission was insanely simple and impossibly complex: to become the bait. 1,100 men had to convince the enemy that they were facing the entire 6th Armored Division of the U.S. Army. 15,000 soldiers, hundreds of real, fire-breathing tanks. For Victor Dowd, an artist accustomed to a pencil and easel, the most dangerous role of his life had begun. He and a few of his comrades donned the uniforms of colonels. Their jeeps were painted with the bright insignia of the 6th Armored. They were the lure. If the Germans saw through the bluff and attacked, they would be wiped out in half an hour. Their only hope was that their theater would be more convincing than German intelligence. Their performance began. The call signs of the 6th Division's headquarters crackled over the radio waves. At night, the recorded roar of tank columns arriving at the front echoed through the hills. By day, smoke from field kitchens rose over the fields, and laundry dried on clotheslines, all to simulate an occupied camp. Inflatable Shermans took up positions, their rubber cannons pointed menacingly toward the enemy. The climax was the actor's entrance. Victor Dowd and his staff officers drove into the nearest town. They acted loud and confident, as victors should. They entered a local bar, knowing that dozens of eyes were watching their every word, their every gesture. And some of those eyes belonged to German informants. Ordering drinks, they began to loudly discuss plans for the upcoming offensive for all to hear. They spoke of the weakness in the German defense, of a breakthrough in the making. It was a brazen, calculated provocation. On the other side of the front, in the German headquarters, reports piled up one after another. Radio intercepts confirmed it. The 6th Armored was here. Aerial photographs showed a massing of equipment. Agents in town reported on overconfident American officers blustering about an attack. The picture was coming together. The enemy had concentrated a powerful armored fist in this sector. For the German general, this wasn't a threat. It was an opportunity. Finally, a clear, tangible target. No more chasing ghosts that appeared and vanished. Here they were, stationary, vulnerable to a flank attack. He looked at the map. It was the perfect moment for a counterattack. Lure them forward a little, and then spring the trap. He gave the order. Prepare the attack. We will annihilate this division. The general was certain he held the fate of the battle in his hands. He didn't know he was aiming at nothing, that his army was preparing to attack 1,000 artists, armed with rubber tanks and theatrical talent. 8 days. For 8 endless days and nights, the 1,100 men of the Ghost Army held a 12-kilometer front. They met every dawn with a single thought. Today, they will strike. They saw every sunset with relief and growing astonishment. Nothing happened. The German tanks remained stationary. Their artillery was silent. Victor Dowd, having played his role as a colonel in the local bar, returned to his position. His mission was a success. A few hours after their performance, German artillery did indeed strike the area where the troops were supposedly concentrating. But it went no further than that. The main attack, the one they both feared and expected, never came. Their bluff was working. But why for so long? On the German side of the front, confidence had turned to frustration. The general stared at the maps, reread the intelligence reports, and couldn't understand what was happening. The U.S. 6th Armored Division, a formidable unit, was simply sitting still. They weren't moving. They weren't attacking. They weren't maneuvering. They were just sitting on the defensive. Why? Why would the Americans move their armored fist here only for it to remain idle? It was illogical. It contradicted their aggressive tactics. The general and his staff looked for a trap. Maybe it's a trap. Maybe they're waiting for us to attack so they can strike somewhere else. Maybe their real strength is far greater than we think. Every report confirming the American presence now only deepened their suspicions. Their inaction was louder than any roaring engine. It screamed that the Germans were missing something. Something crucial was eluding their analysis. The fear of the unknown proved stronger than the lust for an attack. The Germans missed their perfect chance, a chance to break through the front by striking an empty space, defended only by 1,000 actors. They never dared to attack the strong sector. The opportunity was lost. And then, the Ghost Army simply vanished. Overnight, their inflatable tanks were folded up. The radio traffic went silent, and in their place, a real battle-hardened infantry division silently moved in, redeployed while the Germans were paralyzed by the illusion. As the soldiers of the Ghost Army left their positions, they felt an immense sense of relief. They had survived. They had held on. Their theater had stopped real tanks. They didn't know that, at that very moment, the German headquarters was in a state of complete bewilderment. An American armored division had evaporated, simply vanished into thin air, and this inexplicable event became another crack in the foundation of the German High Command's confidence. They were beginning to understand they were fighting an enemy who did not obey the laws of logic, and that was more terrifying than any attack. Bob Tompkins sat in the cramped radio van of a truck, hunched over his radio set. Static crackled in his headphones, the white noise of war. But for him, it was a canvas, and with his Morse key, he painted a picture, as if with a brush. A picture of an entire American division's presence. His war was invisible, silent to all but those who, like him, were listening to the airwaves. The radio operators of the 3103rd Signal Company were masters of their craft. They didn't just transmit nonsensical messages, mimicking chatter between headquarters. They were practicing an art form. Every radio operator, like a person with a unique handwriting, had their own fist, a unique rhythm, a distinctive style on the key. Before each operation, Tompkins' men would spend weeks studying recordings of the radio traffic of the real division they were assigned to impersonate. They listened for the pauses, the speed of transmission, the barely perceptible flaws, and then they learned to forge that handwriting. They were the voices inside the heads of German analysts. When the Ghost Army imitated the 6th Armored, the operator on the air was indistinguishable from the real operator at 6th's HQ. When they impersonated the 30th Infantry, the Morse key in their hands tapped out a rhythm familiar to German interceptors as the fist of that specific division. It was the highest form of deception, an intellectual duel where a single false note could give away the entire orchestra. On the German side, in a radio intercept bunker, chaos was mounting. A specialist, whose job it was to track enemy unit movements by their radio signals, tore off his headphones in despair. The data no longer added up. It was no longer reliable. In the morning, he would get a fix on an American division headquarters in one sector. 2 hours later, the very same call sign, with the same painfully familiar operator's fist, would be broadcasting from 100 kilometers away. It was impossible, but the instruments didn't lie, and neither did the ears of an experienced listener. He was hearing the same headquarters in 2 different places at the same time. The airwaves had gone mad. They were filled with phantoms, ghost divisions that moved with impossible speed, appearing from nowhere and vanishing into nothing. German analysts were drowning in a flood of disinformation. Every radiogram, intercepted and decoded, now raised only one question. Was this real or just another performance? The cornerstone of their intelligence, radio interception, had transformed from a reliable source into a tool of psychological warfare aimed directly at them. Every message Bob Tompkins transmitted from his truck wasn't just a series of dots and dashes. It was a poison, drop by drop, corrupting the German command's confidence that they understood what was happening on the front at all. The war on the airwaves was becoming a war on reality itself, and reality was losing. March 1945, the Rhine River, the last natural barrier on the path to the heart of Germany. For sound engineer Gilbert Seltzer and his team, the loudest and most terrifying concert of their lives was about to begin. Under the cover of an impenetrable March darkness, they drove their half-tracks right up to the riverbank. Only a few hundred meters of water separated them from the enemy, from the nervous, exhausted German soldiers who listened intently to every rustle coming from the American side. Seltzer gave the signal, and the night exploded with sound. From powerful 500-watt speakers aimed at the opposite bank, a symphony of destruction blared. This wasn't just noise. It was a meticulously engineered soundtrack of a pontoon bridge being built. The clang of metal on metal, the roar of bulldozers scraping frozen earth, the sharp shouts of officers giving orders, even the muffled curses of the workers. A complete, absolute, deafening illusion that the Americans were building a crossing right now, right under their noses. On the other side, a German soldier pressed himself into the bottom of his cold foxhole, his heart pounding in time with the hellish noise. He couldn't see anything in the dark, but he could hear. He could hear the enemy preparing to charge. He could hear his own death approaching. He reported over the radio. "They're building a bridge, right across from us. They're building a bridge." And the German artillery answered. Dozens of guns unleashed a hurricane of fire on the source of the sound. Shells whistled over the heads of Gilbert Seltzer and his men. They exploded in the water, on the empty bank, sending up fountains of mud and icy spray. The Americans played them their concert, and the Germans answered with real, deadly shells. For Seltzer and his team, it was a test of endurance. They sat in their truck, packed with equipment, and prayed that a stray shell wouldn't hit them. The louder and more realistic their music was, the heavier the return fire. The closer death came. Their job was considered a success if they started drawing fire. It was the highest, most terrifying compliment to their skill. Every night, this performance was repeated. Every night, the Germans wasted thousands of precious shells, firing into the darkness, at a sound, at a ghost. They were trying to destroy a bridge that didn't exist. And meanwhile, dozens of kilometers away, in complete silence, real American combat engineers were preparing for the real crossing of the Rhine. The symphony of destruction played by Gilbert Seltzer was the overture to the final act of the war in Europe, and it was played on nerves and paid for with real fear. March 19th, 1945. The Moselle River. The operation was routine, one of many. The Ghost Army was once again distracting the Germans from General Patton's offensive. The inflatable tanks were in place. The radio waves hummed with fake orders. Everything was going according to plan. The war seemed like a game, a cruel game, but a game nonetheless, in which they were invincible puppeteers. And then the game was over. A German shell arrived without warning. It wasn't aimed at a specific truck or trench. It was part of the usual harassing fire with which artillery probed the enemy's positions. But this time, it found its mark. The shell struck right in the unit's position, a place that had been bustling with life just a second before. The explosion cut off all sound. The illusion of war was replaced by its deafening, brutal reality. Corporal Seymour Nussenbaum and Private George Peddle were killed instantly. Their bodies, torn apart by shrapnel, lay on the ground that just a moment ago had been the stage for their performance. The wounded were groaning all around. 15 men. Blood mixed with the mud. Cries of pain drowned out the crackle of the radio. For the soldiers of the Ghost Army, it was a shock. They had paid for their deception with real blood. This was no longer a clever performance. This was war. Real. The kind that kills. Their fallen comrades were a brutal reminder. The theater is on the front line, and enemy shells don't distinguish between real soldiers and actors. On the German side of the front, an artilleryman noted with satisfaction in his log, "Direct hit. We took out their command post." For him, it was a success. The direct hit confirmed it. There were indeed enemy troops across the river. There was a real, live target, and the fire on that sector needed to be intensified. Thus, unknowingly, the deaths of 2 American soldiers only strengthened the Germans' belief in the illusion. The tragedy of the Ghost Army became the most convincing argument for its reality. The Germans began shelling the emptiness with renewed fury, certain they were inflicting heavy losses on the enemy. But for the surviving soldiers of the Ghost Army, their world had been turned upside down. Their losses weren't just numbers in a report. They were their friends, artists who had dreamed of a peaceful life. Now they knew the price of their illusion, and that price was measured not in rubber and paint, but in human lives. Their war had forever ceased to be a game. The story of the Ghost Army is not just a tale of military cunning. It is a hymn to human imagination, which proved stronger than steel and gunpowder, demonstrating that the greatest battles are sometimes won not on the battlefield, but in the mind of the enemy. But in the end, what turns out to be more real? A weapon you can touch, or an idea capable of paralyzing an army? Where is the line between illusion and reality, when an illusion saves thousands of real lives? Share your thoughts on this incredible story in the comments. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories where reality is stranger than fiction. And if this video made you think, support it with a like.